The water of Lake Egery is black glass tonight, a mirror so perfect and so cold that it seems to hold the reflection of the moon without a single shiver, as if the lake itself is holding its breath in the dark. We are standing at the edge of a memory here, in a silence that feels heavy, not because it is empty, but because it is full of ghosts who are waiting for us to acknowledge them. The air tastes of snow that hasn't fallen yet, a sharp, metallic tang of iron, and ancient pine needles that stings the back of the throat and wakes the senses even as the world sleeps. It is a stillness that feels earned, the kind of quiet that only settles over a place after a terrible and magnificent noise has finally faded away, leaving the landscape changed forever in ways that maps cannot quite capture. Close your eyes now, and let the darkness of the room wrap around you like a heavy wool blanket, insulating you from the demands of tomorrow. Listen to the rhythm of the water lapping against the stones, a gentle, rhythmic heartbeat that has been counting the seconds here for 700 years, indifferent to the empires that rise and fall along its banks. We are drifting back to a time when the world was sharper, colder, and far more dangerous, a time when the boundaries of nations were drawn not with ink, but with the edges of blades and the roll of falling rocks. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let us step through the mist and onto the frozen mud of the path. It is November 15th, 1315, and the medieval world is about to break. We are hovering over a narrow corridor of land in what is now central Switzerland, a place where the geography itself feels hostile, a landscape of steep slopes and freezing waters that offers no comfort to strangers. To the modern eye, this is a postcard of tranquility, a place for hiking and reflection. But if you look closer, through the lens of history, you can see that the terrain is a weapon. The pass here at Morgarten is a natural choke point, a geographical accident where the mountains shoulder their way down to the waterline, leaving only a fragile thread of a road between the rock and the deep. It is here that the old world order, the rigid, ironclad hierarchy where knights ruled and peasants obeyed, is waiting to die. The silence we hear now is deceptive. It is the silence of a held breath before a scream. In the courts of Europe, in the stone halls of Vienna, and the cathedrals of Rome, the year 1315 feels like the end of days. The Great Famine has been gnawing at the belly of the continent for months, turning summer fields into rotting swamps and stripping the flesh from the bones of the poor. There is a sense of doom in the air, a feeling that God has turned his face away from Christendom, leaving it to the mercy of the rain and the cold. And yet, amidst this grim reality, there is a glittering arrogance marching towards this frozen lake. The House of Habsburg, the rising eagle of Europe, has turned its gaze upon the forest communities of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. These are not grand cities with stone walls and banners. They are rugged, defiant valleys inhabited by men and women who have learned to survive where the air is thin and the soil is thin. They are people of the cow and the axe, free peasants who hold imperial charters that grant them a strange and dangerous autonomy, a freedom that feels like an insult to the landed nobility. Historians still argue whether the conflict that brought them here was driven primarily by the complex geopolitics of the Holy Roman Empire's rival kings, or if it was simply a local territorial dispute that spiraled out of control. But the result remains the same: a collision between two incompatible realities. On one side, the heavy, crushing weight of feudal obligation, personified by men in plate armor who believe they are chosen by divine right to rule. On the other, a fierce, almost feral independence born of the high Alps. As we float above the scene, the dawn is just beginning to crack the grey sky, bleeding a pale, sickly light over the ridges. The ground is hard, frozen into a lattice of mud and ice that crunches underfoot. You can hear the distant, muffled sound of an approaching storm, not of weather, but of steel. It is a low rumble, the vibration of thousands of horses' hooves striking the earth, a sound that usually heralds the end of resistance. To the medieval mind, this sound is the voice of authority. When a knight rides to war, he does not merely bring a sword. He brings the weight of centuries of tradition, the blessing of the church, and the terrifying technology of the heavy war horse and the lance. A knight is a tank made of flesh and iron, a creature designed to shatter infantry formations like glass. The idea that a group of dairy farmers and timber cutters could stand against such a force is laughable. It is a joke told in the taverns of Vienna. After all, peasants do not fight wars, they suffer them. They are the background scenery of history, the anonymous faces who pay the taxes and die in the mud while the great men write the chronicles. But today, the scenery is armed. As we watch the mist curl around the trunks of the fir trees on the slopes of Morgarten, we can sense the anticipation. The Swiss are not waiting in an open field, standing in neat rows to be ridden down. They are up in the trees, hidden in the grey fog, blending into the rock and the moss. They are ghosts in their own home. They have not read the manuals of chivalry that dictate how a battle should be fought. They do not care about honor in the way the Duke down in the valley understands it. They care about survival. There is a tension here that vibrates in the teeth, a realization that the rules of the game are about to be rewritten by people who never agreed to play by them in the first place. The landscape itself seems to be conspiring with them. The temperature has dropped, turning the road along the lake into a slick, treacherous ribbon. The fog is thick, swallowing sound and sight, turning the world into a claustrophobic tunnel. It is into this tunnel that the might of Austria is marching, confident, loud, and utterly blind. They are bringing ropes to hang the ringleaders. They are bringing wine to celebrate the victory. They are bringing the full pomp and circumstance of a feudal punitive expedition, expecting to crush a rebellion and be home in time for the winter feast. They do not know that they are walking into a tomb. As we linger here in the twilight of the morning, watching the breath of the mountain men misting in the cold air, we can see the tragic beauty of what is about to happen. It is a clash, not just of armies, but of eras. The medieval age, with its strict hierarchies and invincible knights, is walking unknowingly toward a precipice. The men waiting in the woods are holding tools that have been repurposed for slaughter: halberds, axes, morning stars, implements of the farm turned into instruments of a new kind of war. They are silent, disciplined, and terrified. Do not mistake their ambush for lack of fear. Their hearts are hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. They know that if they fail today, there will be no mercy. Their homes will be burned, their families scattered, and their names erased from the valley. It is this desperation that sharpens their blades. The silence of the lake is the silence of a scale tipping, the moment of weightlessness before gravity takes hold. We are witnessing the calm before the avalanche, the final heartbeat of a world that thinks it is safe. And as the sun struggles to rise over the peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the ice, the first glint of armor appears in the distance, a river of steel flowing slowly, inevitably, into the trap. The stage is set, the actors are in place, and the curtain is about to rise on a tragedy that will echo for 700 years. The silence of the lake is shattered, not by a war cry, but by the festive, rhythmic jingle of silver bells and the heavy, arrogant clatter of thousands of hooves on frozen earth. If you were to stand on a ridge and look down at the approach of the Austrian army, you would not see a military force preparing for a desperate struggle. You would see a pageant, a glittering river of steel and silk flowing confidently through the winter landscape. At the head of this magnificent and deadly parade rides Duke Leopold I of the House of Habsburg, a man who, at 25 years old, looks every inch the master of the world he believes he owns. He is a creature of the high courts, a young aristocrat draped in the finest velvets and plate armor that gleams like polished mirrors under the pale November sun, reflecting a confidence that borders on delirium. To Leopold, this expedition is not a war. It is an administrative correction, a forceful eviction notice delivered by 9,000 of the deadliest men in Europe to a collection of rebellious tenants who have forgotten their place. He sits high in his saddle, surrounded by the flower of Austrian nobility, men who treat the upcoming violence with the casual excitement of a hunting trip. They are laughing, trading jests over the rising steam of their horses' breath, betting on how quickly the mountain men will scatter when they see the first banner unfurl. There is a terrifying beauty to their ignorance. They move with the relaxed swagger of predators who have never known what it is to be prey, convinced that the natural order of the universe places them at the top of the food chain, divinely appointed to rule over those who smell of manure and pine resin. Leopold's preparations for this campaign betray a fatal misunderstanding of his enemy. In the rigid, codified mind of a Habsburg duke, a legitimate army consists of knights, squires, and men-at-arms, led by noble officers and fighting according to the international laws of chivalry. The Swiss inhabitants of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden do not fit into this neat categorization. To Leopold, they are not soldiers. They are merely peasants behind on their rent, a nuisance to be swatted away rather than a threat to be respected. This psychological blind spot is the seed of the disaster to come. It is why the baggage train following the army is not loaded with extra arrows, medical supplies, or siege equipment, but with casks of expensive wine, crates of fine clothing, and coils of heavy rope. The rope is a particularly chilling detail. It is intended for the mass hangings Leopold plans to host once the Swiss leaders have been rounded up. He has already written the script for the victory celebration in his mind, envisioning a swift, punitive march followed by a few public executions to restore order, and then a comfortable winter basking in the adoration of his court. He treats the invasion like a pageant, a traveling display of imperial power designed to cow the simple-minded hillfolk into submission through sheer spectacle. This arrogance manifests in a complete disregard for military intelligence. The Habsburg column is marching into some of the most hostile, complex terrain in Central Europe. A labyrinth of steep valleys, dense forests, and icy slopes that can turn deadly in an instant. Yet, Leopold has brought no mountain guides. He has established no scouting networks to whisper warnings of what lies ahead. Historians still argue whether this lack of reconnaissance was due to sheer incompetence or a supreme cultural arrogance that simply couldn't conceive of peasants posing a tactical threat. It is likely the latter. One does not send scouts ahead when one is hunting rabbits. To the knights, the idea of creeping cautiously through the woods would be beneath their dignity. They ride with their visors up, their banners snapping loudly in the wind, announcing their presence to the mountains miles in advance. They are a ribbon of noise in a silent land, a glittering intrusion that insults the quiet of the Alps. The army is a glittering ribbon of steel and silk, a phrase that captures both their magnificence and their fragility. They are dressed for a tournament, not for the butchery of a mountain ambush. Their horses are draped in caparisons, embroidered with heraldic lions and eagles, fabrics that will soon be sodden with freezing mud and blood. The knights themselves are encased in suits of armor that are marvels of medieval engineering, proof against sword cuts and arrows, but heavy, cumbersome, and utterly unsuited for climbing steep, ice-slicked slopes. As they move closer to the entrance of the valley, the landscape begins to change, tightening around them like a fist. The broad plains give way to rolling foothills, and the foothills rise sharply into the jagged teeth of the Prealps. The air grows colder, sharper, thinning out as the elevation climbs. The locals, the few who are seen, watch from a distance with unreadable expressions, vanishing into the trees like smoke when approached. There were warnings, of course. Local lords loyal to the Habsburgs had tried to whisper caution into Leopold's ear, suggesting that the Swiss were not merely farmers, but hardened men who knew how to use the terrain as a weapon. They warned that while Leopold had a plan for how to march into the mountains, he had no plan for how to get out if the pass was blocked. But these warnings were brushed aside with a wave of a gloved hand. Leopold is surrounded by an echo chamber of sycophants who reinforce his belief in his own invincibility. They tell him what he wants to hear, that the Swiss are a rabble, that they have no armor, no cavalry, no discipline. They joke that the peasants will likely surrender at the mere sight of the ducal crest. It is a mass delusion, a collective hallucination of safety shared by 9,000 men marching into the mouth of a wolf. The column stretches out for miles, a slow-moving snake of metal winding its way towards the bottleneck of Morgarten. At the rear, the servants struggle with the heavy wagons, cursing the mud and the cold, while at the front, the vanguard rides with an easy, fluid grace. They pass villages that have been abandoned, houses standing empty and silent, stripped of anything valuable. This should be a sign, a red flag waving in the face of the commander, indicating that the enemy knows they are coming and has retreated to prepared positions. But to Leopold, the empty villages are just proof of the peasants' cowardice. He interprets their absence as flight, not maneuvering. He imagines them cowering in the high pastures, freezing and starving, waiting for his justice. He does not imagine them gathering stones. He does not imagine them sharpening halberds. He does not imagine them waiting. The tragedy of Leopold is the tragedy of a man who believes the world operates according to the rules of his own making, who thinks that pedigree and wealth are shields against reality. He is playing at war, treating it as an extension of politics and courtly life, unaware that the game has changed. The mountains do not care about his lineage. The ice does not respect his title. And as the glittering ribbon winds its way toward the dark waters of Lake Egerie, the Duke is not the hunter he believes himself to be. He is the prize stag, fattened on pride and wine, walking willingly toward the butcher's block, leading the finest generation of Austrian nobility into a darkness from which most of them will never return. To understand the slaughter that is about to unfold in the snow, we must first strip away the varnish of romance that centuries of folklore have applied to the Swiss. It is easy, comfortable even, to imagine the men of Schwyz as wide-eyed, innocent freedom fighters, simple shepherds pushed to the brink by a villainous empire. But the truth, as it often does, wears a grittier, darker face. The road to Morgarten does not begin with a noble speech about liberty. It begins with a drunken, violent night of sacrilege that would make a pious man cross himself in horror. The spark for this invasion is not a high-minded debate about sovereignty, but a dirty, decades-long street fight over grass and timber known as the Marchen Streit. In the high Alps, where the growing season is short and the soil is thin, grazing land is not just real estate, it is life itself. For years, the peasants of Schwyz and the Benedictine monks of Einsiedeln Abbey have been locked in a bitter feud over who owns the rights to the alpine pastures. The monks, backed by imperial charters and the heavy seal of the Habsburgs, claim the land is God's and therefore theirs. The peasants, backed by the undeniable fact that they are the ones starving on it, claim it belongs to the people who work it. This simmering pot of resentment boils over on the dark, freezing night of January 6th, 1314, the Feast of the Epiphany. While the rest of Christendom is lighting candles to celebrate the revelation of God to man, a group of armed men from Schwyz is gathering in the shadows, their breath misting in the cold air, their intentions far from holy. They are led by Werner Stauffacher, a man whose name will later be carved into monuments. But tonight he is simply a landholder who has had enough. They descend upon the Abbey of Einsiedeln, not as petitioners, but as a raiding party. The heavy wooden doors, meant to shut out the world and preserve the silence of prayer, are smashed open with axes and brute strength. The silence of the sanctuary is shattered by the crash of boots on stone and the rough shouts of men who have decided that if the church will not feed them, they will feed themselves. What follows is a scene of chaos that Leopold will later use to paint the Swiss as literal agents of the devil. The raiders do not just steal, they desecrate. They storm the abbey's cellars, cracking open casks of wine intended for the Holy Mass. The air, usually thick with incense and the murmur of Latin, fills with the sour metallic tang of spilled vintage and the roar of drunken laughter. They drink the sacramental wine straight from the barrels, wiping their mouths with the sleeves of their rough wool tunics, an act of defiance that strikes at the very heart of medieval religious order. It is a drunken sacrilege, a deliberate spitting in the eye of authority. But they do not stop at the wine. They rampage through the cloisters, tearing down tapestries and overturning altars. They drag the terrified monks from their cells, men of peace who have likely never held a weapon in their lives, and take them hostage, marching them out into the winter night at the point of a spear. It is a brutal, ugly business, a political suicide note written in vandalism and kidnapping. The reaction from the established powers is swift and devastating. In the medieval mind, attacking an abbey is not a crime. It is a war against God. The Bishop of Constance, appalled by the reports of monks being dragged through the snow by drunken herdsmen, unleashed the ultimate spiritual weapon, excommunication. The entire canton of Schwyz is placed under an imperial ban and an ecclesiastical interdict. To a modern listener, this might sound like a bureaucratic formality, but in 1315, it is a death sentence for the soul. It means that the church doors are locked. It means no baptisms for the babies born in the winter dark, no last rites for the dying, and no consecrated ground for the dead. The people of Schwyz are branded as spiritual outlaws, cut off from the grace of heaven, leaving them exposed to the fires of hell. They are now heretics, pariahs, dead men walking in the eyes of the church. For Duke Leopold, this news is a gift wrapped in silk. It transforms his punitive expedition from a mundane dispute over rent and borders into a holy crusade. He is no longer just a duke crushing a rebellion. He is the sword of God, sent to cleanse the mountains of these agents of the devil who dare to plunder the bride of Christ. The excommunication strips the Swiss of their humanity in the eyes of the Habsburg knights. You do not negotiate with men who loot abbeys, you exterminate them. It provides the moral lubrication for the massacre Leopold is planning. He can now tell his men, with the full backing of the clergy, that killing a Swiss peasant is not a sin, but a service to the church. It hardens the hearts of the invaders, removing any lingering hesitation they might have had about riding down fellow Christians. These are not Christians anymore. They are excommunicated rabble, wolves who have bitten the hand of the Lord. Historians still argue whether the raid on Einsiedeln was a calculated act of provocation designed to force a conflict on the Swiss terms, or if it was simply a riot that spun wildly out of control, fueled by alcohol and years of repressed anger. But the intent no longer matters. The result is absolute. The raid has burned the bridge back to peace. The men of Schwyz know there is no turning back now. They have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The interdict hangs over their valley like a storm cloud, a constant reminder that they are alone in the universe, abandoned by the Pope and hunted by the Emperor. This spiritual isolation breeds a terrifying kind of desperate unity. They are not fighting for a king or a flag. They are fighting because the world has left them no other choice. They are cornered animals, stripped of their spiritual protections and facing an enemy who views their destruction as a holy duty. As we watch the aftermath of the raid fade into the months of tense preparation, we can see how this act of sacrilege sets the emotional temperature for the battle to come. It ensures that there will be no compromise. Leopold is not coming to collect taxes. He is coming to execute heretics. And the Swiss are not gathering to protest. They are gathering to survive the apocalypse that they themselves helped to unleash. The wine spilled on the floor of the abbey cellar has turned into the blood that will soon stain the ice of Lake Ageri. The die is cast, not by generals in a war room, but by angry men in a cellar, drunk on wine and rage, unaware that their hangover will take the form of 9,000 knights marching up the road. The march in stride has metastasized into a war for survival, and the drunken laughter of that January night has been replaced by the grim silence of November, where the only sound left is the sharpening of steel. The trap does not look like a trap. To the eyes of the Habsburg commanders, it looks simply like a road, albeit a miserable one. As the sun climbs higher, struggling to burn through the persistent fog that clings to the valley floor, Duke Leopold leads his glittering ribbon of steel and silk away from the open plains and into the tightening throat of the landscape. We watch from the slopes above as the army begins to deform, forced by the geography to shed its impressive, wide-fronted battle formations and stretch out into a thin, fragile thread. The entrance to the kill box is subtle at first, a gradual narrowing of the horizon, but soon the reality of the terrain imposes its will upon them. To their left lies the freezing slate-grey expanse of Lake Egery, its waters deep and unforgiving, lapping hungrily at the muddy shoreline. To their right, the earth rears up violently into the steep, timber-clogged slopes of Morgarten Mountain, a wall of rock and pine that blots out the sky. Between these two immovable forces runs the track, a muddy, rutted path barely wide enough for two horsemen to ride abreast, and in some places so constricted that the knights are forced to ride single file. This geography is not an accident. It is a natural guillotine, a geological choke point that strips the heavy cavalry of its greatest advantages, mass and maneuverability. A knight on a charger is a weapon of shock, designed to thunder across an open field in a wall of steel, smashing through enemy lines with kinetic fury. But here, trapped in this narrow corridor, the knight is reduced to a passenger on a stumbling horse. The invincible heavy cavalry is transformed by the terrain into a traffic jam. The immense destriers, bred for power rather than agility, slip and slide on the frozen mud, their iron-shod hooves striking sparks against the hidden stones. The knights, encased in 60 pounds of plate and mail, sit stiffly in their saddles, their vision limited by the narrow slits of their visors, their hearing muffled by the padding of their helmets. They are sensory deprived, insulated from the world by the very armor meant to protect them, unaware that the walls of the valley are closing in. Leopold's decision to take this route is the subject of grim fascination. Historians still argue whether he was guided here by treachery, or if he was simply outmaneuvered by a masterclass in strategic denial. The Swiss had spent the weeks prior busily reinforcing the other, more accessible entrances to their valleys, the passes at Arth and Brunnen, with defensive walls known as Letzi. These fortifications were not necessarily meant to stop the Austrian army permanently, but to discourage them, to act as a shepherd's crook guiding a flock of sheep. By blocking the easy roads, the Swiss subtly, invisibly funneled the Habsburg invasion force toward the one door they had left unlocked, the deadly defile at Morgarten. Leopold, believing he has found a weakness in the peasant defenses, is actually walking through the only gate the Swiss wanted him to enter. He believes he is flanking the enemy, unaware that he is being heralded into a pen. As the column presses deeper into the pass, the mood among the men begins to shift. The easy laughter and the jests about hunting peasants fade, replaced by the grumbling of men who are cold, bored, and uncomfortable. The ribbon of silk and steel loses its luster in the gloom of the mountain shadow. The bright velvets become damp with the mist. The polished steel dulls under a layer of condensation. The sheer length of the column becomes a liability. With 9,000 men squeezed into this narrow track, the army stretches out for miles. The vanguard, led by the heavy cavalry, is separated from the baggage train in the rear by a vast distance of confused, halted, and slow-moving bodies. Messages cannot be passed back and forth. Commands shouted at the front die in the wind before they reach the center. The army is lobotomized, its brain severed from its body. If something were to happen at the front, the men at the back would not know for an hour. They are effectively paralyzed, a dragon that has crawled into a cave too small to turn around in. Yet Leopold rides on, his blind adherence to chivalric doctrine acting as a blinder against reality. In his world, the world of tournaments and open field battles, enemies meet face to face. They announce themselves with trumpets. They exchange challenges. The idea that the Swiss would hide in the woods and drop rocks is so alien to his concept of warfare that it barely registers as a possibility. He expects the Swiss to be waiting for him in the valley basin at the end of the lake, where the ground opens up and he can deploy his cavalry to crush them properly. He views this march along the lake merely as a commute, a tedious necessary step before the real work begins. He does not realize that the commute is the battle. He is looking at the horizon, searching for an army standing in formation, completely missing the threat that is breathing quietly in the undergrowth just 50 yards up the slope. The sensory experience of the march is overwhelming in its claustrophobia. The smell of thousands of horses, wet fur, sweat, and manure mixes with the sharp scent of pine and the metallic tang of the lake water. The sound is a constant, grinding din, the clatter of loose scabbards against greaves, the squelch of hooves in half-frozen mud, the creak of leather saddles, and the low murmur of thousands of voices. This wall of noise acts as a cloak for the Swiss. Up on the slopes, the peasants can move with relative impunity, their own sounds masked by the cacophony of the invasion below. They watch the glittering ribbon wind its way beneath them, a river of gold and iron that looks unstoppable from a distance, but reveals itself to be disjointed and chaotic upon closer inspection. They can see the knights struggling to keep their horses calm on the ice. They can see the gaps in the line where the mud has slowed the advance. They can see the faces of the men through their open visors, faces that are flushed with cold and irritation, but not yet with fear. Leopold's banner, the Red Lion of Habsburg, hangs limp in the damp air, a splash of crimson against the grey rock. He is now deep inside the kill box. The vanguard has reached the narrowest point of the track, a place where the mountain pushes so close to the water that the road is little more than a ledge. The trap is primed. The Swiss have allowed the head of the serpent to enter, waiting until the bulk of the heavy cavalry is fully committed to the bottleneck. It is a moment of excruciating tension. The physics of the disaster are locked in place. All that is missing is the spark. The geography has done its work. It has taken a complex, hierarchical, professional army and reduced it to a mob in a hallway. The natural guillotine is raised. The blade is heavy with boulders and tree trunks, suspended by nothing more than the restraint of a few hundred men holding their breath, waiting for the signal. And down below, the Duke adjusts his gloves, looks up at the dark canopy of the forest, and sees nothing but the trees. He assumes the silence of the woods is the silence of emptiness. He is wrong. It is the silence of a held breath. The ribbon of silk and steel has wound itself around the neck of the empire, and the mountain is about to pull it tight. The trap does not spring with a shout, but with a sudden, jarring halt that ripples down the line like a shudder moving through the spine of a dying animal. At the very front of the column, where the vanguard of the heavy cavalry has been picking its way fastidiously through the mud, the road simply ends. The knights find their path blocked not by a formation of soldiers they can charge, but by a crude, ugly scar across the landscape, a barricade of felled trees, milestones, and earth that seals the exit of the pass as effectively as a cork in a bottle. This is the moment the natural guillotine locks the victim into place. The sudden stop at the front sends a kinetic shockwave traveling backward through the army. The knights behind, unaware of the blockage, continue to ride forward, crashing into the rear of the men ahead of them. The elegant spacing of the procession collapses instantly. Horses rear and whinny in protest as they are forced to check their stride on the slick ice. Metal grinds against metal as stirrups lock and armor plates collide. The glittering ribbon buckles, folding in on itself, transforming from a disciplined column into a confused, compression-packed mob. To the Swiss watching from the high ridges, hidden in the tree line like raptors, this is the critical moment of alchemy. They are watching the Austrian army transform from a military force into a target. Historians still argue whether the obstruction at the front was a pre-existing border fortification known as a letzi that the Austrians had simply underestimated, or a hastily erected barricade of tree trunks thrown up the night before by the men of Schwyz. But to the knights staring at the rough wall of timber, the origin matches less than the reality. They are stuck. The geography has conspired to create a perfect prison. To their left, the waters of Lake Egery are deep, cold, and indifferent. To their right, the slopes rise up like the walls of a canyon, too steep for a horse to climb. Behind them, thousands of their own men are pushing forward, blindly sealing the retreat. They are packed so tightly now that some knights cannot even draw their swords. They are sardines in a steel can, a phrase that captures the horrifying intimacy of the disaster. The personal space required for combat, the room to swing a blade, to turn a horse, to lower a lance, has vanished. They are no longer warriors. They are merely men in metal boxes, pinned against the flanks of their horses, breathing in the steam of panic that is beginning to rise from the crush. Leopold, riding near the center of the column, is initially more annoyed than alarmed. He interprets the halt as a delay caused by peasant incompetence, a minor nuisance like a fallen tree or a broken cart. He shouts orders to clear the rubbish, expecting the obstacle to be swept aside by his vanguard. He does not realize that the rubbish is a calculated anvil against which his army is about to be hammered. He cannot see the front. He can only see the backs of the men before him and the impatient faces of the men behind. The noise in the valley changes pitch, shifting from the rhythmic clatter of the march to a discordant, nervous murmur. The horses, sensitive to the mood of their riders and the claustrophobia of the crush, begin to panic. They toss their heads, their eyes rolling white, their hooves slipping on the frozen track, threatening to crush the foot soldiers squeezed between them. The army is fighting itself before the enemy has even revealed a weapon. It is a slow-motion catastrophe, a tightening of the noose that feels suffocating even to describe. The air in the pass grows heavy, thick with the smell of sweat and the palpable realization that something is wrong, terribly, structurally wrong. From the vantage point of the Swiss, The kill box is now full. The density of the target has reached the mathematical perfection required for their plan. They have waited with a discipline that defies the stereotype of the angry mob. They have watched the first 1,000 men pass, then the second, then the third, resisting the urge to strike until the bulk of the cavalry is trapped in the narrowest sector of the defile. It is a terrifying display of patience. They understand that if they attack too soon, the tail of the dragon might escape. If they wait too long, the head might break through the barricade. They have waited for the Goldilocks moment of slaughter, where the density of the Austrian knights ensures that a stone dropped from the heights cannot miss. Every square yard of the road below is filled with flesh and steel. The Swiss are not looking at individual men. They are looking at a carpet of enemies. The trap is not just the physical barricade. It is the psychological paralysis that comes from being halted in a place where you cannot move. The knights are looking around, scanning the steep, timber-clogged slopes to their right, finally noticing the unnatural silence of the woods. They see the mist curling around the roots of the trees, the dark shadows that seem to be watching them. A few of the veterans, men who have fought in the wilder borders of the empire, feel the hair on their arms stand up. They recognize the texture of an ambush. They start to shout warnings, pointing up at the ridge, but their voices are lost in the din of the confusion. It is too late for warnings. The mechanism of the trap has already engaged. The guillotine blade, suspended in the form of massive tree trunks and boulders poised on the lip of the ridge, is ready to drop. The Swiss signal is given, not a horn blast that would warn the enemy, but perhaps a simple hand gesture, a nod from a captain lying in the snow. The natural guillotine does not need to be sharp. It only needs to be heavy. The world holds its breath for one final agonizing second. The knights below are looking at the road, at the lake, at each other. Then the first sound comes from above. Not a battle cry, but a deep, earthen groan, the sound of the mountain itself giving way. It is the sound of gravity being weaponized. The knights look up, and for a fleeting instant, they see the sky blocked out not by clouds, but by the falling earth. The kill box is closed. The arrogance of the march, the wine in the baggage train, the ropes for the hangings, all of it is rendered instantly irrelevant by the physics of what is coming down the slope. The trap has snapped shut, and the only way out is into the water or into the history books. The sky above the pass does not darken with arrows, as the manuals of chivalry might suggest. It darkens with the earth itself. The attack begins with a sound that few men in the column have ever heard in the context of war, the deep, tearing groan of ancient root systems snapping, and the thunderous rumble of gravity taking hold. From the high ridges of Morgarten, the Swiss unleash a barrage that owes nothing to the art of fencing and everything to the brutal laws of physics. Massive tree trunks, stripped of their branches and prepared as rolling battering rams, are levered over the edge of the cliffs. They tumble end over end, gaining terrifying speed as they crash through the undergrowth, smashing into the flank of the Austrian army with the force of a runaway train. But they are only the heralds. Following the timber comes a rain of boulders. Stones the size of wine barrels, rocks the size of anvils, dislodged by the hundreds and sent careening down the ice-slicked slopes. It is a landslide manufactured by human hands, a weaponization of the landscape that turns the mountain into an active participant in the slaughter. To the knights trapped below, looking up through the slits of their visors, it must seem as if the Alps themselves have rejected their presence, as if the very geology of the region has risen up to crush them. This initial bombardment reveals a cruel and decisive tactical insight, one that changes the nature of the afternoon instantly. While plate armor is a marvel of engineering against the edge of a blade, it is pitifully useless against the crushing weight of kinetic energy. A suit of Milanese steel is designed to deflect the tip of a lance or the slash of a sword. It operates on the principle of glancing blows, but a 50-pound boulder dropping from a height of 300 feet does not need to pierce the steel to kill the man inside. It operates on the principle of trauma. When a rock strikes a helmet, it does not cut. It compresses. It collapses the steel onto the skull, shattering vertebrae and snapping necks like dry twigs. When a tree trunk slams into the side of a horse, it does not leave a flesh wound. It shatters the rib cage and pulps the organs beneath. The invincible, heavy cavalry is not being outfought. It is being crushed. The armor that was their pride has become their coffin, a steel cage that traps the shockwave of every impact, turning their protection into a conductor for their own destruction. The scene in the pass descends instantly into a chaos that defies military description. It is no longer an army. It is a bowling alley where the pins are made of flesh and iron. The air fills with a cacophony that is physically painful to hear. The sickening crunch of stone on metal, the high-pitched screaming of maimed horses, and the shouts of men who are watching their comrades being erased by falling debris. The glittering ribbon is shattered. The tight, disciplined formation that Leopold was so proud of becomes a liability. The men are packed so closely together that when a horse goes down, it takes 3 others with it, creating tangles of flailing limbs and steel that block the road completely. There is no room to dodge. A knight who sees a boulder coming has nowhere to move. He is hemmed in by the lake on one side and his brothers in arms on the other. He can only brace himself and pray, watching the rock grow larger until the lights go out. Historians still argue whether the Swiss used sophisticated engineering to trigger these rockfalls, perhaps holding back debris with ropes that could be cut simultaneously, or if it was a more primal individual effort of men simply shoving stones off a ledge. But the effect is the same: the disintegration of the Austrian command structure. The boulders do not discriminate between duke and squire. They smash the banners into the mud, removing the visual rallying points for the army. Officers are crushed mid-shout. The carefully planned hierarchy of the feudal system is flattened by the indiscriminate violence of the avalanche. Leopold, somewhere in the churning center of this disaster, watches his world come apart. The illusion of the hunting trip is gone, replaced by a primal terror. This is not war as he knows it. There is no enemy to charge, no champion to challenge. There is only the mountain falling on his head. The psychological impact of this bombardment is as devastating as the physical one. For the knights, who view themselves as the pinnacle of martial prowess, to be killed by a falling rock is a humiliating, ignoble death. It strips them of their agency. They are not dying as warriors. They are dying as victims of an industrial accident. The panic that ripples through the column is primal. Horses, maddened by the noise and the pain, begin to stampede. But they have nowhere to run. They trample their own masters, crushing fallen knights into the frozen mud. The rear of the column, still unaware of the full scale of the horror at the front, continues to push forward, compressing the mass even further, feeding more men into the kill box. The pressure is immense. Men are being crushed to death, not by the rocks, but by the sheer weight of the crowd, squeezed until their breath fails in a riot of their own making. Meanwhile, high above the carnage, the Swiss work with the cold efficiency of laborers. There is no frenzy here, no wasted motion. They are not dueling. They are exterminating. They move in small, coordinated teams, leveraging the rocks, cutting the retaining ropes, guiding the timber. They are safe, untouched, watching the destruction they have unleashed with a grim satisfaction. They know that every rock that finds a mark is one less night they will have to fight hand to hand. They are softening the target, tenderizing the meat of the Austrian army before the final course. It is a brutal, pragmatic approach to warfare that ignores the gentleman's agreement of the nobility. They are not interested in a fair fight. They are interested in winning. The physics of slaughter is on their side, and they are using gravity as their primary ally. As the rain of stones begins to slacken, not because the Swiss are showing mercy, but because they have run out of ammunition, the pass at Morgarten looks like the site of a natural disaster. The road is choked with broken bodies, shattered wagons, and riderless horses thrashing in the gory slush. The pristine silence of the morning has been replaced by a low collective moan of agony. But the silence that follows the rockfall is not a reprieve. It is a transition. The Swiss have broken the formation. Now they must break the men. The softening up phase is over. Up in the tree line, the men of Schwyz stand up from their crouches. They pick up their primary weapons, the halberds, the morning stars, the axes. They adjust their crampons on their feet. The mountain has done its part. Now it is time for the butchers to descend. The knights below, dazed, concussed, and terrified, look up to see the mist parting, revealing not more rocks, but a wave of men rushing down the slope with the sure-footed agility of mountain goats. The avalanche of stone has ended. The avalanche of steel is about to begin. As the dust from the rockfall begins to settle, settling like a grey shroud over the broken column, the nature of the noise changes. The thunder of the landslide is replaced by the rhythmic, terrifying crunch of boots biting into ice. The Swiss do not charge with a chaotic scream. They descend with a terrifying, purposeful agility that seems almost supernatural to the men watching from below. The knights, those who are still mounted, are struggling simply to keep their horses upright on the frozen, gore-slicked mud. They are sliding, stumbling, their mounts splaying their legs in panic, effectively playing Bambi on ice in 60 pounds of steel. In stark contrast, the men of Schwyz move with the sure-footed grace of predators in their natural element. They have prepared for this specific topography. Lashed to the soles of their boots are improvised crampons, simple wooden boards driven through with iron spikes that bite deep into the frozen slope, giving them perfect traction where the Austrians have none. It is a small technological innovation, a piece of farm equipment adapted for war. But in this moment, it is worth more than all the plate armor in the Holy Roman Empire. It turns the slope from a barrier into a highway, allowing the Swiss to dance around the clumsy sliding giants below them. They flow down the mountain, not like an army, but like water finding cracks in a stone, seeping into the gaps of the Austrian formation, bringing with them a weapon that will redefine the geometry of death for the next 2 centuries. They carry the halberd. To the uninitiated eye, it looks like a crude hybrid, a confused marriage between an axe and a spear mounted on a 6-foot ash pole. But to the knights who are about to receive it, the halberd is a terrifyingly perfect answer to their existence. It is 3 weapons in one, a multi-tool designed specifically to dismantle the technological advantage of the mounted aristocrat. As the Swiss crash into the stunned Austrian line, we see the terrible efficiency of this design in motion. The first element, the heavy axe blade, is a triumph of kinetic energy. Swung with the full leverage of the long handle, it strikes with force enough to shear through a horse's tendons or split a heater shield in two. We watch as a Swiss peasant, a man who has likely spent his life chopping wood, swings the halberd with the muscle memory of a lumberjack. The blade catches the neck of a destrier, and the great beast collapses instantly, sending its rider crashing into the mud. The axe is the brute force, the hammer that cracks the shell, proving that even the finest Milanese steel has a breaking point when met with sufficient leverage. But it is the second element of the halberd, the hook, that transforms the battle from a fight into a harvest. Located on the back of the axe head, this cruel curved thorn is designed for a single humiliating purpose: to drag a knight from his saddle. In the swirling melee, we see the Swiss hooking the riders by their armor straps, their belts, or the rims of their shields. With a sharp, practiced yank, they pull the knights down from their high perches. It is a moment of profound psychological horror for the nobility. For centuries, the height of the horse was a symbol of their station, a physical manifestation of their superiority. To be dragged down into the muck is to be stripped of that status. Once the knight hits the ground, the weight of his armor, which was his protection a moment ago, becomes his prison. He is a turtle on its back, flailing in the slush, unable to rise, his expensive plating turning into a coffin that holds him down while the battle rages above him. The hook turns the knight's greatest asset, his heavy, impenetrable shell, into a liability, trapping him in the mud where he is slow, clumsy, and vulnerable. Then comes the third element, the spike. This is the needle that finds the thread. Once a knight is grounded, thrashing in the confusion, the Swiss reverse their grip, using the long steel point at the tip of the halberd to finish the work. The armor of 1315 is not a seamless suit. It is a collection of plates held together by straps and mail, with necessary gaps for movement, the armpits, the groin, the back of the knees, and the narrow eye slits of the visor. The spike is designed to seek out these gaps. It is a weapon of intimacy. We see the Swiss moving through the wreckage, planting the spikes with grim precision, bypassing the steel plates entirely to deliver the final blow. It is a cold, mechanical process, devoid of the flourish of swordplay. There is no parrying here, no ringing of steel on steel. There is only the dull thud of the hook dragging a man down and the wet punch of the spike finding home. The halberd democratizes the violence. It allows a man with no training in fencing to kill a man who has trained for war since childhood, simply by applying the laws of leverage and anatomy. The sensory experience of this phase of the battle is horrific in its muffled intensity. Inside the helmets, the knights are deafened by their own breathing and the ringing of blows against their skulls. Their vision is limited to the narrow, terrified slice of the world visible through their visors. They cannot see the blow coming until it is too late. They feel the sudden weightlessness of the fall, the jarring impact with the frozen ground, and then the terrifying realization that they cannot get up. The Swiss, meanwhile, are fighting with the silence of focused labor. They do not waste breath on insults. They work in pairs or threes, swarming isolated knights like ants taking down a beetle. One hooks the rider, another strikes the horse, a third delivers the mercy stroke. It is a dismantling. The invincible, heavy cavalry is being taken apart piece by piece, their formation shredded into isolated pockets of desperate resistance. The famous Austrian discipline dissolves into a frantic individual struggle for survival. Historians still argue whether the halberds used at Morgarten were the fully developed weapons seen in later museum pieces, or a more primitive proto-halberd known as the Volge. Yet, the distinction matters little to the men dying in the pass. Whether the blade was forged by a master smith or beaten out of a plowshare by a village blacksmith, the geometry of the slaughter remains the same. The long reach of the pole allows the Swiss to strike from outside the range of the knights' swords. The knights are swinging blindly at enemies they cannot reach, their blades cutting only the air, while the halberds strike with the rhythm of a threshing machine. The bowling alley has become a slaughterhouse. The narrowness of the track, which prevented the knights from maneuvering, now prevents them from escaping. They are trapped between the wall of the mountain and the wall of their own dead. The snow is turning into a slush of crimson and brown, churning under the feet of the peasants who move with such terrifying assurance. The technological asymmetry is absolute. It is not just a battle of men. It is a battle of systems. The rigid, expensive, heavy system of feudal warfare is crashing against the fluid, adaptable, ruthless system of the mountain infantry, and the result is a massacre that defies all the expectations of the age. The ribbon of silk and steel has been cut into ribbons, and the Swiss are walking over the pieces, their halberds dripping, looking for the next banner to drag into the mud. The Battle of Morgarten is not remembered simply because the underdog won. It is remembered because of how they won, and specifically for what they refused to do. Until this freezing afternoon in November, medieval warfare between Christians operated under a widely understood, if unwritten, gentleman's agreement. In the high-stakes poker game of feudal combat, a knight was too valuable to destroy. He was a walking bank account, a chaotic mix of political leverage and hard currency wrapped in steel. If a noble found himself cornered, unhorsed or outnumbered, the custom was to raise his visor, drop his sword, and offer his gauntlet in a gesture of surrender. This was the transaction of the age. The victor gained a wealthy prisoner who could be ransomed back to his family for a chest of gold, and the loser gained his life, likely spending a few months in a comfortable tower playing chess until the funds cleared. War for the nobility was a business, often less lethal than a bad outbreak of dysentery. But as the Habsburg knights struggle in the mud of the pass, raising their hands to signal capitulation, they discover with dawning horror that the men of Schwyz do not speak the international language of aristocracy. The Swiss mountain men are not looking for business partners. They are looking to exterminate a threat. They stare blankly at the frantic offers of gold, at the shouting of titles and lineages. To a shepherd from Uri, a ransom is a meaningless abstraction. What is he to do with a captured duke? Where would he keep him? How would he feed him? And most importantly, why would he trust him? To the Swiss, these men are not honorable opponents playing a game. They are armed invaders who came with ropes to hang village elders and torches to burn farmhouses. The Swiss logic is cold, binary, and terrifyingly practical. A knight who is ransomed is a knight who will return next summer, angry and better prepared. A knight who is dead will never come back. The decision is made not with malice, but with the grim efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. There will be no prisoners, there will be no quarter. This policy transforms the battlefield from a military engagement into a scene of methodical butchery. We watch as the social contract of Europe is hacked to pieces alongside the men who invented it. A Habsburg baron, trapped under his fallen horse, shouts out the name of his estate, promising enough silver to buy a herd of cattle. The Swiss answer is the silent, wet thud of a morning star crushing his helmet. A young squire, barely a man, falls to his knees, weeping and clasping his hands in prayer, invoking the mercy of the Virgin Mary. The peasant standing over him does not hesitate, driving a spear through the boy's throat to silence the noise. It is a violation of the natural order, so profound that it will send shockwaves through the courts of France and England for decades. To the chroniclers of the time, this is not war. It is a crime. It is a bestial fury that places the Swiss outside the bounds of civilized humanity. They are not acting like soldiers. They are acting like wild animals who have tasted blood. But if we look closer, past the horror of the nobility, we see the desperate rationality of the insurgent. The Swiss are fighting an asymmetric war. They are vastly outnumbered in the grand strategic sense. They cannot afford the luxury of mercy. Every man they let walk away is a man who contributes to the inevitable counterattack. Historians still argue whether this no-quarter policy was a premeditated order given by leaders like Werner Stauffacher to ensure total commitment, or if it was a spontaneous eruption of class hatred, a release of decades of pent-up resentment against the arrogance of their overlords. The sources suggest a mix of both, a command from above that found fertile soil in the anger of the men below. The result is a slaughter that ignores the rules of caste. The halberd does not care if the man beneath it is a count or a cook. The democratization of death is absolute. The atmosphere in the pass shifts from the panic of the ambush to the grim determination of the execution. The noise of battle, the clashing of steel, fades, replaced by the sickening sounds of the mopping up. It is the sound of metal tools striking meat, of heavy boots squelching in mud that has turned into a red slurry. The Swiss move through the wreckage of the column, checking bodies. They lift visors and drive daggers into eyes. They slit the throats of the wounded who are groaning in the ditch. It is intimate violence, face-to-face work that requires a terrifying hardness of heart. They strip the dead, not just of their lives, but of their dignity, looting weapons and armor that will be repurposed for their own defense, but leaving the silk and velvet to rot in the mire. They have no use for the trappings of vanity. For the surviving Habsburg knights, this realization that their surrender is not accepted breaks their minds before it breaks their bodies. We see men who have been trained to fear nothing but God suddenly paralyzed by the sheer alien nature of their enemy. They are facing men who do not want their money, who do not respect their bloodline, and who do not fear their wrath. It is a total negation of their identity. The invincible knights are reduced to screaming meat, trapped in a bottleneck where their status offers no shield. They fight now not for glory, but with the frantic, clawing desperation of rats in a barrel. Some try to climb the steep slopes, their fingers staring at the frozen roots, only to be pulled back down by the hooks of the halberds. Others try to fight back to back, forming small islands of resistance that are quickly swamped by the tide of grey wool and iron. The brutality of Morgarten acts as a message, written in blood on the snow, that the rules have changed. The Swiss are signaling to the Empire that the cost of subjugation will be higher than the treasury can bear. They are introducing a concept of total war to a world that is used to limited conflict. This is not a dispute over a border. It is a struggle for existence. And the Swiss have decided that their existence requires the absolute negation of the enemy. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, the piles of the dead grow higher, blocking the road more effectively than the barricade ever did. The gentleman's agreement lies dead in the mud, trampled under the boots of men who never signed it, and the concept of chivalry bleeds out into the cold waters of Lake Egery, never to fully recover. The age of the knight is not just ending, it is being murdered, and the men holding the knife are not sorry. The road is a butcher's block, but for hundreds of Austrian knights, the only escape from the halberds lies to the left, the freezing slate-grey expanse of Loch Egery. As the crush on the narrow track becomes unbearable, pushed by the weight of their own panic and the relentless advance of the Swiss infantry, the edge of the column begins to spill over the embankment. It is a desperate, frantic migration, a choice between the immediate certainty of the axe and the uncertain mercy of the water. Men and horses tumble down the short, steep bank, splashing into the shallows with a noise that sounds less like a military maneuver and more like a bridge collapsing. At first, the water seems like a sanctuary. It offers space, a reprieve from the claustrophobic press of bodies and the suffocating heat of the crush. But as the knights wade deeper, seeking to put distance between themselves and the shore, the lake reveals itself to be a trap far more cruel than the mountain. The tragedy of Lake Egery is a tragedy of physics. A medieval knight in full campaign gear is carrying between 60 and 80 pounds of hardware. He is wearing a padded gambeson, a hauberk of riveted chainmail, and plates of steel lashed to his limbs and chest. On land, this weight is manageable, distributed across the body, and supported by a lifetime of physical conditioning. But in the water, the laws of buoyancy turn this protection into an anchor. As the horses panic in the freezing mud of the lake bed, throwing their riders or collapsing under them, the knights plunge into the deep. The moment the water closes over their heads, the armor that made them gods on the battlefield ensures they will die like stones. The horror is slow and silent. We watch from just above the surface as men struggle against the inevitable drag of their own equipment. They thrash wildly, their gauntleted hands clawing at the surface, trying to find purchase on water that simply yields and swallows them. But the weight is relentless. It pulls them down, feet first, dragging them into the darkness of the glacial depths. The most terrifying aspect of this death is the helplessness. Medieval armor is not designed to be removed quickly. It is a complex system of buckles, leather straps, and points that requires a squire and several minutes of patient work to disassemble. A knight cannot simply undress while drowning. He is sealed inside his suit, a prisoner in a sinking cell. He feels the water rushing into his helmet, filling his nose and mouth, the cold shock seizing his lungs. He can see the light of the surface shimmering just a few feet above him, a tantalizing, unreachable window to the world of the living, but he cannot reach it. He is perfectly preserved, a statue of steel drifting down to the silt, his eyes wide with a terror that no one will ever see. For those who manage to stay in the shallows, the situation is hardly better. The lake bottom is a treacherous mix of slime and unstable rocks. Horses, maddened by the cold and the noise, thrash violently, kicking and trampling the men trying to cling to their reins. The water turns into a frothing soup of mud and blood, obscuring the footing. Knights who slip under the surface are often kept there, not by the depth, but by the tangled mass of other bodies, men and beasts, fighting for the same cubic foot of air. It is a chaotic, fluid grave where rank means nothing. A count drowns just as quickly as a man-at-arms. The water fills the lungs of the nobility with the same indifference as it fills the lungs of a horse. Historians still argue whether the Swiss actively pursued the knights into the water or simply stood on the bank and let the lake do the work. The sources suggest a mix of both. Some chroniclers describe Swiss peasants using their long pikes to push struggling knights back into the deep, denying them the shore, effectively baptizing them in the freezing waters of their own arrogance. Others suggest the Swiss were too busy looting and killing on the road to bother with the stragglers in the lake. But the result is the same. The lake becomes the final resting place for a significant portion of the Habsburg army. The surface of Lake Egerie, usually so calm, is broken by the last bubbles of dying men, a grim effervescence that marks the end of noble lineages that stretch back centuries. The sensory experience of the drowning is a stark contrast to the cacophony on the road. Above the water, there is screaming, the clash of steel, the roar of the slide. Below the water, there is only a muffled, rushing silence and the crushing pressure of the cold. It is a lonely, isolated death. We can imagine a knight, perhaps a man who had laughed that morning about the hunting trip, now sinking through the twilight of the water column. He feels the heavy wool of his undergarments soaking up the freezing water, adding more weight to his descent. He feels the pressure building in his ears. His last sensation is not the glory of combat, but the biting cold of the alpine winter claiming him for its own. He becomes part of the geology of the lake, his armor eventually rusting into the mud, his bones settling among the stones that will hold his secret for eternity. As the sun sets, the surface of the lake slowly begins to quiet. The thrashing stops, the ripples fade, the water returns to its glass-like state, hiding the carnage beneath a mask of perfect stillness. Hundreds of men are gone, vanished, as if they never existed, leaving behind only the riderless horses that have managed to swim to the far bank, shivering and exhausted. The glittering ribbon that had marched so proudly along the shore has been swallowed by the landscape. The mountain took half, the lake took the rest. The natural guillotine has finished its cut. The water of Lake Egerie is no longer just water. It is a mass grave, a cold storage for the ghosts of an empire that thought it could conquer the wild without paying the toll. The silence returns to the lake, but it is a heavier silence now, weighted down by the iron on the bottom. In the center of this swirling vortex of mud, blood, and freezing water, Duke Leopold I sits on his horse, a man undergoing a violent deconstruction of his own reality. The glittering ribbon is gone. The laughter of the morning is a memory so distant, it feels like it belongs to another life. Around him, the air is thick with the screams of dying men and the terrified whinnying of horses, a chaotic symphony that drowns out any attempt to give orders. Leopold is no longer the commander of an imperial army. He is a spectator to the end of his world. He watches, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and disbelief, as the flower of Austrian nobility is harvested like wheat before a storm. He sees men he grew up with, cousins, childhood friends, drinking companions, being dragged from their saddles by dirty, bearded men they would not have deigned to speak to a day ago. He sees the banner of the Habsburgs, the red lion that was supposed to strike terror into the hearts of rebels, trampled into the slush, stained with the same mud that coats the peasants' boots. The psychological impact on Leopold is total. He has not just lost a battle, he has lost the narrative of his life. He was raised on the stories of chivalry, on the belief that noble blood acted as a kind of divine shield, that God would always grant victory to the righteous ruler. But there is no God here in this dark valley, only gravity and steel. The hunting trip has turned into a nightmare where the rabbits have grown teeth, and the hunter is the one caught in the snare. We can see the color draining from his face, a physical manifestation of the shock that is shutting down his system. Chroniclers of the time, writing with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude, describe him as looking like a dead man walking, his face drained of all color, a mask of wax melting in the heat of the catastrophe. He is weeping, not the dignified single tear of a tragic hero, but the ugly, ragged sobbing of a young man who is terrified and overwhelmed. He is weeping with rage at the unfairness of it all, at the peasants who won't fight by the rules, and with sheer primal terror at the realization that he might die here anonymously in a ditch. The escape, when it comes, is not a brilliant tactical withdrawal. It is a frantic scramble for survival. Leopold is surrounded by a small knot of bodyguards, men who are still functioning on instinct, slashing at the hands, reaching for the Duke's bridle. They realize that the battle is lost, that the only objective remaining is to keep the dynasty alive. They grab the reins of Leopold's horse, turning the beast away from the blockade and forcing a path back the way they came. But the road behind is a graveyard of crushed wagons and panicked horses. To escape, the Duke of Austria must ride over his own men. We watch as the remnants of the ducal party trample the wounded, forcing their mounts through the press of the rear guard who are still trying to push forward, unaware that they are marching into a slaughter. Leopold has to fight his way out of his own army. There is a grim irony in what he leaves behind. The baggage train, that rolling symbol of his arrogance, is abandoned in the chaos. The casks of wine intended for the victory feast are smashed open by looters or crushed by falling rocks, their contents spilling into the snow, mingling with the blood of the knights who never got to drink them. The ropes, brought with such confidence to hang the Swiss ringleaders, are now being used by the Swiss to bind the few prisoners they bother to take, or simply left in the mud as a useless testament to the Duke's hubris. And perhaps most poignant of all is the fate of his court. Among the dead is Kuoni von Stocken, the Duke's court jester, The man whose job was to make the Duke laugh, to turn the world into a joke, lies broken on the road, his motley clothes stained dark, a final tragic punchline to a campaign that treated war like a carnival. The death of the fool signifies the death of the fantasy. The pageant is over. The lights have been smashed. Historians still argue about the exact route of Leopold's flight, whether he was guided by a traitorous local who knew a goat path through the hills, or if he simply possessed the devil's own luck to find a gap in the chaos. But the manner of his arrival in Winterthur that night is not up for debate. He rides into the city gates hours later, alone or with a handful of shattered retainers. He is unrecognizable. His magnificent armor is dented and covered in filth. His velvet surcoat is torn. His horse is foaming and blown. The people of Winterthur, who had watched him ride out days earlier in a blaze of glory, stare in silence at the ghost who has returned. He is a broken man. He shuts himself in the castle, refusing to speak, trembling with the aftershocks of the trauma. He has looked into the abyss of the kill box and seen the future of warfare, and it has terrified him to his core. Leopold will live for another 11 years, but he will never be the same. The shadow of Morgarten will hang over him like a curse. He will fight other battles, but the swagger is gone, replaced by a nervous caution. He has learned the lesson that the Swiss intended to teach, that the old rules no longer apply. He has seen that a peasant with a halberd is the equal of a duke on a charger, provided the ground is chosen well. As he sits in the dark of the Winterthur castle, shivering despite the fire, he tries to scrub the memory of the lake from his mind, the sound of the ice cracking, the sight of the drowning men, the terrible, silent judgment of the mountains. He is the highest-ranking survivor of the disaster, the living witness to the death of his own era. He rode out a god. He returns a man humbled by the rocks and the peasants of Schwyz. The arrogance of the Habsburgs has been left in the mud at Morgarten, replaced by a cold, hard fear that will keep the empire at bay for generations. The Duke survives, but the part of him that believed he was invincible has died in the pass, drowned alongside his knights in the black waters of Lake Egery. When the sun finally rises over the valley of Morgarten on the morning of November 16th, it reveals a landscape that has been rewritten by violence. The mist that had hidden the ambush the day before has returned, but now it clings to a scene that looks less like a battlefield and more like the aftermath of a catastrophic natural disaster. The road is no longer a road. It is a scar of churned mud, shattered timber, and broken steel stretching for miles along the lakeshore. In the cold light of day, the full scope of the impossible math of the victory begins to take shape, a statistical anomaly that will baffle the chroniclers of Europe for generations. As the Swiss move among the dead, stripping the bodies of weapons and armor, they are not just counting corpses. They are counting the cost of an era ending. The numbers that emerge from the carnage are staggering, so lopsided that they seem to belong to the realm of myth rather than military history. On the Habsburg side, the loss is catastrophic. Nearly 2,000 men lie dead in the pass or at the bottom of the lake. But it is not just the quantity of the dead that matters. It is the quality. These are not nameless conscripts. They are the backbone of the Austrian administration, the landed gentry, the magistrates, the knights who held the keys to castles and the seals to courts. Entire lineages have been extinguished in a single afternoon. The casualty list reads like a who's who of the Holy Roman Empire's Eastern nobility. On the other side of the ledger, the numbers are equally hard to believe. The Swiss chroniclers, writing with a mixture of pride and religious awe, report that they lost only 12 men. Even if we allow for the inevitable exaggeration of victors, perhaps the number was 20 or 50, the disparity remains a statistical impossibility in the context of medieval warfare. In the accepted calculus of the time, a force of peasant infantry attacking heavy cavalry should have been wiped out. Instead, they achieved a kill ratio that defies logic. This is the moment the math of feudalism breaks. The equation that stated 1 knight is worth 10 peasants is proven false. In the mud of Morgarten, the equation has been inverted. 1 peasant with a halberd and a good position is worth 100 knights who cannot move. It is a terrifying realization for the ruling class, a sudden, vertigo-inducing shift in the perception of power. The old world order relied on the assumption that violence was the monopoly of the rich, that only those who could afford the horse and the armor could wield power. Morgarten proved that violence is the great equalizer, available to anyone with a heavy rock and the will to use it. As the news of the disaster spreads outward from the valley, radiating across the passes to Zurich, Basel, and eventually to the imperial courts of Vienna and Avignon, it is met with a stunned disbelief. The chroniclers of the age struggle to find the language to describe it. They cannot write that peasants defeated knights, because that sentence does not make sense in their worldview. It is like saying sheep ate the wolves. Instead, they reach for supernatural explanations. They write of divine punishment, of the sins of Leopold calling down the wrath of God. Peter of Zittau, a contemporary chronicler, describes the event not as a battle, but as a judgment, a moment where the natural laws were suspended by a higher power. They focus on the bestial cruelty of the Swiss, emphasizing the lack of prisoners and the slaughter of the drowning, trying to frame the victors as subhuman monsters to preserve the dignity of the losers. If the Swiss are monsters, then the knights were not defeated by men, they were overwhelmed by a force of nature. This narrative allows the nobility to sleep at night, but it cannot hide the trembling fear that has seized the heart of the aristocracy. Historians still argue whether the casualty figures were manipulated by the Swiss to enhance their reputation, or by the Austrians to magnify the tragedy. But the political fallout is undeniable. The marketing campaign of Morgarten is an instant success. The victory serves as a gruesome but effective advertisement for the Swiss method of war. Almost overnight, the perception of the Swiss changes from rebellious shepherds to giant killers. The cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, previously seen as backwater territories, are suddenly viewed as a fortress of terrifying military potential. The Pact of 1291, the founding document of their alliance, is no longer just a piece of parchment. It is a blood oath forged in iron. The victory cements the bond between the forest communities, proving that their collective security model works. They realize that alone they are vulnerable, but together, in the terrain they know, they are invincible. This is the psychological birth of the Swiss Confederation, not in a meeting room, but in the shared trauma and triumph of the kill box. The aftermath also sees a profound shift in the economic destiny of the region. The Swiss have just discovered their most valuable export: violence. The weapons and armor stripped from the Habsburg dead are not just trophies, they are capital. The halberds that hacked down the knights become symbols of a new profession. The young men of the mountains, seeing the effectiveness of their tactics, begin to realize that their skills have a market value beyond their own borders. If they can kill Austrian dukes for free, imagine what they could do for pay. The impossible math of the battle catches the eye of every king and pope in Europe. They see a force that is disciplined, fearless, and cheap compared to the maintenance of a standing cavalry. The seeds of the mercenary system are sown here in the blood-soaked snow. The Swiss are on their way to becoming the power brokers of Europe, the essential ingredient in any army that wants to win. But amidst the grand geopolitical shifts, there is a smaller, more intimate reality on the ground. The people of Schwyz are left to clean up the mess. The harvest of war is a grim task. They drag the bodies of the knights into mass graves, burying the men who wanted to hang them. They retrieve the bodies of their own 12 dead, men who likely knew every tree and rock in the valley, and carry them home to be mourned as heroes. There is a solemnity to the victory. They know they have poked the bear. They know that the Habsburgs will not forgive this humiliation. They understand that by shattering the gentleman's agreement, they have ensured that all future wars will be wars of annihilation. They have bought their freedom, but the price is eternal vigilance. They have become the porcupine of Europe, a creature that is peaceful if left alone, but bristling with deadly quills if touched. The victory at Morgarten is not the end of their struggle. It is the beginning of a long, armed watch that will last for centuries. The silence that settles over the lake now is the silence of a fortress that has pulled up the drawbridge. The world has changed, and the Swiss are the ones who changed it. One falling rock at a time. The impossible has happened, and now they must live in the new reality they have carved out of the mountain. The snow eventually melts in the valley of Morgarten, washing the blood into the soil and feeding the roots of the pines that still stand watch over the past today. But while the physical evidence of the slaughter fades with the seasons, the legacy of that freezing November afternoon hardens into something more durable than granite. The victory does not merely secure the borders of 3 small forest cantons. It ignites a fire that will burn across Europe for the next 200 years. From the carnage of the ambush rises the most terrifying and lucrative export in Swiss history: the professional soldier. The men who stood on the ridge watching the Austrian knights drown realize that they possess a commodity that kings are desperate to buy. They have proven that infantry, when disciplined and fighting for each other, can break the spine of feudal cavalry. The Battle of Morgarten acts as the violent debut of a brand, a marketing campaign written in the red ink of Habsburg blood. It tells the world that the Swiss do not just farm cows, they farm war. And unlike the knights who fight for honor or titles, the Swiss fight for a contract. They bring a business mindset to the battlefield, a professionalism that is terrifying in its reliability. This transition from freedom fighters to mercenaries of the crown is a complex evolution. Historians still argue whether this shift was driven by the sheer economic necessity of the Alpine population, where the land simply could not feed all the sons born to it, or by a calculated political strategy to keep neighbors afraid and coffers full. Regardless of the motive, the result is the rise of the Reisläufer, the traveling warriors. The halberd, so effective in the tight confines of the ambush, evolves into the pike, an 18-foot spear that allows the Swiss to bring their mountain tactics to the open plains of Italy and France. We see the development of the pike square, a formation that is essentially a mobile fortress, a bristling forest of steel points that can roll over enemies like a steamroller. It is the direct tactical descendant of the log barricade at Morgarten. It is a system where the individual is nothing and the unit is everything. A philosophy born in the communal survival of the high valleys. The hedgehog that defended the pass now marches across the continent, dismantling the armies of Burgundy and the Holy Roman Empire with the same cold efficiency they used on Leopold. The reputation of these men becomes so formidable that battles are often decided simply by who can afford to hire them. They become the power brokers of Europe, the silent partners in the Game of Thrones. Kings who wish to sleep soundly at night hire Swiss guards to stand outside their bedchambers, trusting the men of the mountains more than their own scheming nobles. This trust culminates in the most famous contract of all, the agreement with the Vatican. In 1506, Pope Julius II, admiring the invincible spirit of the Swiss cantons, invites them to Rome to serve as his personal protectors. The pontifical Swiss Guard that we see today, standing in the Vatican courtyards in their Renaissance uniforms of blue, red, and orange, are not actors in a costume drama. They are the living, breathing lineage of the men who waited in the snow at Morgarten. Every halberd held by a modern Swiss guard is a callback to the weapon that hooked the knights from their saddles. Their oath of loyalty is the same oath of discipline that held the line against the Austrian cavalry. When you look at them, you are looking at history standing at attention, a direct line of DNA and doctrine that stretches back to the moment the first rock was rolled down the mountain. Ultimately, the Battle of Morgarten lays the foundation for the unique Swiss concept of armed neutrality. It teaches the cantons a lesson that becomes the cornerstone of their national identity. That peace is not a gift from neighbors, but a space carved out by the promise of extreme violence. The Swiss become the porcupine of Europe, a nation that announces clearly, "We do not want your land, but if you try to take ours, you will bleed." This doctrine of deterrence, born in the kill box of 1315, allows a small, diverse confederation to survive in the middle of a continent tearing itself apart with wars. It shatters the medieval assumption that some men are born to rule and others to serve. The peasants of Morgarten proved that free men fighting for their own soil and their own families possess a morale that no amount of gold or lineage can purchase. They demonstrated that the divine right of kings ends where the reach of a halberd begins. As we step back from the history, floating away from the dark waters of Lake Egerie and the shadow of the mountain, we can see the full arc of the story. It is a tale of how arrogance was undone by preparation, how a hunting trip became a holocaust, and how a group of underestimated farmers changed the map of the world. The noise of the battle has long since faded. The armor of the knights has rusted into the lake bed, becoming part of the geology. The screams have been replaced by the silence of the snow. But the echo of that day remains in the independence of a nation and in the quiet confidence of a people who know that they are the descendants of giant killers. The old world order did not die peacefully in its sleep. It was crushed by falling rocks and farming tools in a narrow pass, reminding us that history is not written by those who think they own the future, but by those who are willing to fight for their present. The mountain stands silent now, a monument to the day the world turned upside down, and the ghosts of Morgarten sleep in the deep, guarding the memory of the day the peasants became kings of the battlefield. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a soft bed of glowing embers, casting a warm, pulsing light across the room. The history book is closed now, its leather cover cool to the touch, the stories of knights and mountains resting safely between the pages. The noise of the battle, the clash of steel, and the cold wind of the Alps have all drifted away, leaving only the quiet of your own space. You are safe here, anchored in the present, far from the freezing mists of the past. Let your breathing slow down, matching the gentle rhythm of the fading light. The world outside is asleep, and there are no more armies to watch, no more strategies to plan. There is only the stillness of the night and the heavy, comfortable weight of rest settling over you. You have walked through centuries tonight, but now it is time to stop walking. It is time to let the mind drift like a leaf on a calm lake, floating effortlessly into the dark. The story is done. The silence is yours. Close your eyes, let the darkness wrap around you like a soft blanket, and drift away. Sweet dreams.